The Memphis air in the late 60 decade carried a kind of urgency heat rising from the sidewalks, the thump of drums slipping through studio walls, and a label searching for its next heartbeat. When a company loses the artists who helped define its sound, what does it take to rebuild? And who steps forward when a music empire finds itself suddenly vulnerable? This is the story of the Soul Children, a group born from necessity but destined to carve out a sound all their own. Their voices carried drama, longing, and the unmistakable grit of Memphis soul during one of the most turbulent chapters in Stax history. Before we begin, grab yourself a warm drink, settle in, and let me know where you're watching from. And if you believe in giving flowers to the legends time almost forgot, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story. Long before they ever blended their voices together inside a Memphis studio, the story of the Soul Children began with a record label on the edge of reinvention. By the middle of the 1967 period, Stax Records was facing one of the most pivotal shifts in its history. The partnership with Atlantic had ended, and with that severed relationship came a devastating blow: the loss of Sam and Dave, the duo who had carried some of the label's biggest hits. At a time when Stax needed strength, stability, and identity, it suddenly found itself without two of its cornerstone stars. But crisis has a way of revealing the most unlikely opportunities. Inside those same halls, two creative giants, Isaac Hayes and David Porter, were quietly becoming the heartbeat of the label. Their songwriting and production shaped the sound of Memphis soul with a craftsmanship that felt both raw and cinematic. And when the label needed a new act to help fill the void left behind, Hayes and Porter didn't look outward, they looked inward. They believed Stax had everything it needed to rebuild if only the right voices could be brought together. Their idea was bold: a vocal group with two men and two women, each one strong enough to sing lead, each one capable of holding emotional weight. Not a typical quartet, but a dramatic ensemble in song form. A group that could tell stories about heartbreak, temptation, infidelity, longing, and redemption with the intensity of a Southern soap opera. That is how the Soul Children were born. The first member to step into the picture was John Colbert, a young singer whose voice carried a gritty tenderness that could break a silence wide open. Memphis residents knew him as Blackfoot, a nickname given during childhood when he would walk barefoot across hot sidewalks in the summer heat. Before joining the group, he had released solo singles and later joined the reformed Barkays after losing its original members in the tragic Otis Redding plane crash. His voice held history, pain, resilience, everything Hayes and Porter wanted. Then came Norman West, a Louisiana native whose earliest lessons in music came from the walls of a church. Singing hymns with his brothers Joe, James, and Robert developed his grounded, soulful tone. He had already recorded solo tracks, joined the Del Rios, and even fronted a rock group called Colors Incorporated. His voice was warm and steady, the anchor every quartet needs. Anita Louie brought something different: grace, subtlety, and diction. She had already sung background vocals for Hayes and Porter's recordings, so they understood the texture her voice could bring to harmonies. She could rise into a line without overtaking it, and fall back without disappearing. Her presence gave the group a softness that balanced the intensity of the men. Last came Shelbra Bennett, a young vocalist newly signed to the label. Her tone was sharp, expressive, and emotionally fearless. She could deliver a line with vulnerability one moment and raw power the next. Bennett was the spark, bright, unpredictable, and exactly what the group needed to round out its dynamic. When the four voices finally came together, something electric happened. The blend wasn't just good, it was cinematic. Each voice had its own personality, but together they created the sound Hayes and Porter envisioned: soul that felt like a living, breathing story. Behind the scenes, the energy at Stax in the late 1960 decade was both hopeful and tense. The label was rebuilding after a loss, searching for new identities, new possibilities, new stars. The Soul Children arrived right at that moment, stepping into a space where the stakes were high and expectations higher. But it was also a time of tremendous creativity. Musicians from Booker T and the MGs were constantly walking in and out of studios. Writers, arrangers, and producers shared ideas in hallways. Music seemed to rise from the floors themselves, and in that environment, the Soul Children were shaped not only by the talent they brought with them, but by the city, the label, and the cultural moment that demanded something new. Their story didn't begin with fame. It began with a label that refused to give up, two visionary producers searching for a fresh sound, and four voices whose paths converged at exactly the right time. The Soul Children were born from necessity, but they would soon prove they were much more than a solution. They were a statement, a sound, a force ready to take on the next chapter of Memphis soul. When the Soul Children finally stepped into the studio for their first official recordings, the atmosphere surrounding them still carried the electricity of a label fighting to reclaim its voice. Hayes and Porter knew exactly what they wanted: to shape a group that could take the emotional gravity of Memphis soul and expand it into something theatrical, something grown, something honest. And in late 1968, the group's debut single, Give Them Love, became the first test of that vision. The song was built on a warm, steady groove with harmonies that felt both tender and urgent. It didn't explode onto the charts, but it made a meaningful impression, reaching number 40 on the R&B chart. More importantly, it introduced listeners to something different: a four-person vocal unit capable of weaving storylines inside the spaces of a single track. Hayes and Porter used each singer's strengths strategically: Blackfoot's grit, West's steadiness, Bennett's sharp delivery, and Louis's gentle balance. The sound was unmistakable. Their follow-up singles continued shaping that identity. I Take What I Want reached number 29 on the R&B chart, strengthening their foothold in Southern soul radio markets. The third single, Tighten Up My Thang, maintained momentum with a number 49 R&B ranking. While none of these early tracks achieved national breakout status, each release served as another building block for the group's emerging reputation, a reputation rooted in intensity, personality, and a grown folks' approach to storytelling. Their early catalog didn't shy away from complicated emotions. Themes of infidelity, desire, and emotional conflict gave their music a striking maturity. Unlike many groups of the period, they were not selling the polished optimism of pop. They were leaning into the tension and vulnerability that defined adult soul. Hayes and Porter crafted the songs almost like scenes in a drama: two male voices on one side of the story, two female voices on the other, each line responding to the emotional stakes of the last. Then came a bold move covering Hold On I'm Coming, the Sam and Dave classic closely tied to Stax history. Their rendition reached number 48 on the R&B chart, proving that the group had the vocal power and confidence to reinterpret a signature hit without losing themselves in the process. The choice carried symbolic weight, a new group paying tribute to the very act that Stax had just lost, bridging the label's past and present. By this point, the buzz around the Soul Children inside Stax was undeniable. Musicians, engineers, and writers were beginning to recognize the group not merely as a Hayes Porter project, but as a genuine creative force. Their harmonies filled Studio A with a sound unlike any other act on the roster: deeper than pop, sharper than gospel, more dramatic than traditional R&B. Every recording felt like another step toward the moment when everything would finally come together. That moment arrived at the end of 1969, when the Soul Children released the single that would change their trajectory entirely, a record that didn't just chart, but broke through, a song that elevated them from rising act to national presence. But that turning point, the one that finally brought the Soul Children into the spotlight, was only the beginning of what would become the most defining chapter of their career. The momentum that the Soul Children built throughout the late 1968 and early 1969 period was promising, but nothing fully prepared them or Stax for what came next. Late in the 1969 year, the group released a record that would become their breakthrough moment, the song that finally revealed what Hayes and Porter had envisioned from the start. That single was The Sweeter He Is. Where earlier tracks had hinted at potential, The Sweeter He Is delivered clarity. The record opened with a slow, aching build, its arrangement steeped in the warm, cinematic soul that defined Memphis during this era. The harmonies unfolded like a confession. Bennett and Louis carried the emotional edge, while West and Blackfoot grounded the narrative with a kind of weary tenderness that felt painfully real. It was grown, folks, soul, delivered without apology. The track climbed to number 7 on the R&B chart, and crossed onto the pop chart at number 52, an early and important sign that the group's sound could resonate far outside Southern markets. Its success fueled the release of their debut album, Soul Children, which featured musicians from Booker T and the MG's Booker T. Jones on organ, Steve Cropper on guitar, Donald Duck Dunn on bass, and Al Jackson Jr. on drums. Having these legendary players behind them didn't just elevate the music, it cemented the group's place within the creative core of Stax. They weren't simply another vocal act, they were part of the label's heartbeat. But just as everything seemed to settle into place, a shift occurred that reshaped the group's path. By the early 1970 period, Isaac Hayes, one of their founders, mentors, and creative architects, stepped away from producing the group to pursue his solo ambitions. His departure was not abrupt, but it was deeply felt. Hayes had been their guiding force, the one who understood the full emotional potential of their four-voice dynamic. Without him, the group had to navigate new territory, still anchored by their talent but missing the steady hand that had shaped their earliest successes. Their second album, Best of Two Worlds, attempted to expand their sound but failed to make a chart impact. It wasn't a lack of effort or artistry. It was simply the transitional period, a moment where the group was searching for a new creative identity while the industry was shifting beneath them. Many artists fractured during this phase, but the Soul Children did the opposite. They doubled down on craft, stepped deeper into their emotional storytelling, and waited for the right collaboration to spark the next chapter. That spark arrived with the 1972 album Genesis, produced by Jim Stewart and Al Jackson. The lead single, Hearsay, captured everything the group did: best call and response storytelling, rich harmonies, and a groove that felt both intimate and relentless. The track soared to number 5 on the R&B chart and number 44 on the pop chart, re-establishing the group as a force within the changing landscape of soul music. And then, in 1973, they delivered what would become the defining moment of their career, the song that pushed them to their greatest commercial height, I'll Be the Other Woman. Written and produced by Homer Banks and Carl Hampton, the track climbed to number 3 on the R&B chart and number 36 on the pop chart. The song was raw, vulnerable, drenched in emotional conflict. Bennett's lead delivered the story with gut-wrenching honesty, and the group's harmonies wrapped around her like the walls of a confession booth. This stretch from The Sweeter He Is to I'll Be the Other Woman became the arc that defined the Soul Children. It was the moment when they stopped being a promising Stax act and became one of the label's most essential voices during a turbulent era. What they didn't know then was that the peak they had reached would soon collide with forces far outside their control. The triumph was real, but the shadows were already forming. By the early 1972 and 1973 period, the Soul Children had reached a level of artistic clarity that only a handful of groups ever touch. The years of building, refining, and surviving shifts within the Stax machine had carved them into something unmistakably powerful. Their sound, once experimental, once shaped by necessity, had now become a defining voice of Memphis soul during one of its most volatile eras. What made this period so triumphant wasn't just chart success, though the numbers reflected their momentum. It was the sense that everything they had endured, the early struggles, the lineup adjustments, the loss of Isaac Hayes as their guiding architect had somehow sharpened them rather than weakened them. Their voices blended with a maturity that felt lived in, confident, certain, even cinematic. When Hearsay became a major hit in the 1972 year, the group stepped fully into a new dimension. The song showcased their remarkable ability to turn emotional tension into musical conversation. Each voice played a role, weaving accusations, confessions, and denials into a tightly wound narrative. It wasn't just soul music, it was storytelling. Listeners felt it immediately. Radio programmers recognized the record's staying power, and Stax saw them as one of the final bright lights holding the label together during an increasingly difficult stretch. The success of Genesis allowed the group to tour extensively, performing in major cities where audiences were seeing them not just as background voices in the Stax roster, but as headliners capable of commanding a room. Then came the high point, the release of I'll Be the Other Woman in the 1973 period. The single didn't just climb the charts, it resonated. Bennett's lead vocal was devastating. Her delivery captured the ache of longing, the weight of compromise, and the vulnerability of loving someone you can't fully have. Behind her, West, Louis, and Blackfoot shaped a chorus that felt like emotional gravity, supporting, echoing, and amplifying every word. The song became their biggest hit, and with that success came something even more significant: identity. The Soul Children were no longer viewed as a replacement for what Stax had lost. They had become one of the label's emotional anchors. Their music didn't rely on flash, choreography, or spectacle. It relied on voices raw, unfiltered, and human. On stage, they were magnetic. Each member brought something distinct: Blackfoot's grit, Bennett's fire, Louis's grace, West's church, rooted steadiness. Together, they created a sonic landscape that could shift from delicate to thunderous within a single verse. Concert audiences leaned into their performances, drawn in by the honesty of their delivery. There was no pretense, no disguise, just emotion, lived out loud. This was their triumph, not simply the commercial success, but the artistic realization of what Hayes and Porter had envisioned years earlier: a group where every member mattered. A group where harmony wasn't just about notes, but about truth. A group that could take the complexities of adult relationships and turn them into music that listeners still recognize, decades later, as painfully real. For a brief, extraordinary moment, the Soul Children stood at the center of Memphis soul. They were not just surviving the era's changes, they were shaping its emotional vocabulary. But even at the height of their brilliance, forces beyond their control were gathering, and the light surrounding them would soon begin to shift. Even as the Soul Children enjoyed the brightest moments of their career, the shadows around them were already beginning to darken. The early '70s decade was a time of massive transition for the American music industry, and nowhere was that shift felt more sharply than inside the walls of Stax Records. The same label that had nurtured them, believed in them, and helped shape their artistic identity was quietly unraveling beneath financial pressure, distribution problems, and changes in leadership that strained the company from the inside out. For the Soul Children, these changes weren't immediate blows. They were slow-moving tremors, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Budgets tightened, promotion thinned. The certainty that once surrounded Stax's best acts began to fade. And with each passing month, it became harder for any artist, no matter how talented, to break through the noise of an increasingly competitive market. Musically, the world was changing too. Funk was becoming heavier, more electric. Early disco was forming its own identity. Soul was evolving toward sharper edges and more socially charged themes. Meanwhile, the Soul Children's strength, intimate, adult storytelling, delivered through layered harmonies, felt increasingly out of step with the commercial expectations of the moment. Their music still resonated deeply, but radio programmers were shifting priorities, and labels were chasing trends that didn't align with the group's emotional style. Inside the group, the pressure of constant recording and touring also began to take a toll. The years spent building their catalog had been rewarding, but exhausting. The harmony that once flowed effortlessly now required more energy. Artistic decisions became heavier. And without Isaac Hayes guiding their earliest steps, or the full stability of Stax behind them, they were left to navigate challenges largely on their own. The release of Friction, one of their strongest and most emotionally charged albums, should have been a triumphant reaffirmation of their place in soul music. Instead, it arrived during a period when Stax was struggling to stay afloat. Even great records can disappear when a label lacks the power to push them. And that is exactly what began to happen. The music was strong, but the machine behind it was failing. As the 1975 period approached, the collapse of Stax became a reality. For the Soul Children, this was more than a business loss. It was the loss of their home, their identity, and the creative ecosystem that had given them life. Their triumph had been real, but it now lived side by side with uncertainty. The stage lights were still shining, the voices were still powerful, but the world beneath their feet was shifting, and the first hints of decline were beginning to settle around them. When Stax Records officially collapsed in the 1975 period, the impact on the Soul Children was immediate and deeply personal. This wasn't just the end of a label, it was the loss of the ecosystem that had shaped every part of their identity. The studios where they found their sound, the producers who understood their strengths, the musicians who helped translate their emotions into arrangements, all of it vanished almost overnight. For a group so closely tied to the spirit of Stax, the collapse felt like the ground giving way beneath their feet. In the aftermath, the members faced an emotional and creative crossroads. Their peak years had been built on an environment that celebrated their complexity. 2 men, 2 women, each with a distinct voice and point of view. Without that structure around them, the group struggled to determine who they were supposed to be next. Their harmonies were intact, their talent undeniable, but the loss of a home base left them without direction. Still, they pushed forward. The trio of West, Colbert, and Louis, now without Shelbra Bennett, who left to pursue a solo path, signed with Epic Records in the 1976 period. Their new chapter began with Finders Keepers, a record that carried the same polished vocal interplay but lacked the emotional gravity of their Stax years. The title track reached number 49 on the R&B chart, a respectable showing but a far cry from the chart positions they once commanded. The creative energy around them was shifting as well. Soul music was evolving faster than ever. The lush, slow-burning storytelling that defined their sound was being overshadowed by new styles built on groove, rhythm, and dance. Funk and disco dominated radio. Record labels poured money into trend-driven acts. And in this new landscape, a 4-person vocal ensemble known for dramatic ballads found it harder to carve out space. Fatigue also played a quiet but powerful role. After nearly a decade of recording, touring, and adjusting to constant changes, the group was emotionally worn. The workload was relentless, the expectations exhausting, and the pressure to compete with younger, more contemporary acts weighed heavily on them. Without the unified support system that Stax once provided, the members were often left to navigate career decisions alone, making compromises they wouldn't have faced in earlier years. Their follow-up releases under Epic, including If You Move, I'll Fall, and the album Where Is Your Woman Tonight, showed flashes of brilliance but didn't shift the trajectory. Even with David Porter returning as producer, the momentum they once relied on had faded. By the late 70s decade, the crisis was undeniable. They were still fighting, still recording, still hoping for another breakthrough. But the world had changed around them, and the sound that once felt so essential now struggled to find its place. As the late 70s decade approached, the consequences of years of instability, shifting trends, and emotional exhaustion finally began to settle over the Soul Children. What had started as a slow drift away from the spotlight was now turning into a clear downward path, one shaped not by scandal or internal collapse, but by a changing musical landscape and the quiet fatigue of artists who had given everything they had for nearly a decade. By the 1979 period, the group made the difficult decision to disband. There was no farewell tour, no celebratory final performance, no grand announcement. Their ending mirrored the nature of their career, honest, understated, and deeply tied to the realities of the industry they had long fought to stay afloat in. The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was simply the closing of a chapter. Once the group parted ways, each member faced their own crossroads. Anita Louis stepped away from the music industry entirely. After years of performing, traveling, and pouring her voice into songs that carried the emotional weight of adult soul, she chose stability. She worked at FedEx, Time Warner, and later became a professional business trainer. Her departure from music wasn't a retreat, it was a shift toward a life with steadier ground. Norman West continued performing, leaning into nightclubs and gospel, returning to the roots that had shaped his voice long before Stax ever entered the picture. His tone, warm, seasoned, spiritual, found a home in smaller rooms where the spotlight wasn't blinding and the expectations weren't crushing. Then there was John Colbert, better known as Jay Blackfoot, whose post-Soul Children career became the most visible. In the early 1984 period, he released Taxi, a heartfelt ballad that reached number 4 on the R&B chart and reintroduced him to a national audience. The success of Taxi was not just a second chance. It was proof that the emotional grit he brought to the Soul Children had always deserved a wider audience. His solo career became a kind of living tribute to what the group had achieved together. Shelbra Bennett, recording under the name Cher Dean, also carved out her own path. Her 1000, 977 single Don't Touch Me reached number 50 on the R&B chart, and she continued recording into the early 80 decade. Her voice, sharp, fearless, and unmistakable, retained the emotional charge that made her contributions to the Soul Children so memorable. Years later, in the 2007 period, West and Blackfoot reunited the group with two new members, Ann Hines and Cassandra Graham. They released Still Standing, a title that symbolized more than their return to music. It symbolized their resilience, a refusal to let time erase the harmonies they had built. But life, as always, moved forward with both joy and sorrow. Jay Blackfoot passed away from pancreatic cancer on the 30th of November 2011 at age 65. Shelbra Bennett followed on the 31st of May 2013 at age 66. Their departures left a quiet ache in the history of soul music. The consequences of their decline were real: fewer opportunities, fading national visibility, and the slow erosion of the spotlight. But what remained, what continues to remain, is the emotional power of their music, the legacy of voices that carried groan, folk's truth, and the imprint they left on the landscape of Southern soul. In the years that followed their final charting moments, the legacy of the Soul Children settled into a space that is both rare and quietly powerful. They were never the loudest act on the scene, nor the most heavily marketed, but their music carried a depth that resonated long after many of their contemporaries faded from memory. Their place in soul history cannot be measured strictly through chart numbers or commercial impact. It lives in the emotional honesty they brought to the genre, the stories they told, and the unique space they carved out within the Stax tradition. For many listeners and historians, the Soul Children represent the essence of what Southern soul was capable of at its most vulnerable and mature. Their harmonies, two men and two women trading lines, confessions, and confrontations, created a sonic texture unlike anything else in the late 60 and early 70 decade. They were storytellers, capturing the emotional landscape of grown relationships with a rawness that felt startlingly real. Their songs did not romanticize life. They reflected it. The Sweeter He Is remains one of the clearest windows into their artistry, slow, building, cinematic, and heavy with longing. Hearsay captures the dramatic edge of their sound, the way their voices could turn accusations into melody. And I'll Be the Other Woman stands as their defining masterpiece, a ballad that continues to be rediscovered by younger audiences who find its emotional honesty as relevant today as it was in the 1973 period. Their influence is most visible in the generations of R&B artists who embraced storytelling rooted in adult themes, artists who followed the path that the Soul Children helped clear. Their ability to inhabit characters within a song, to give voice to complicated emotional realities, would echo through works by singers in the Quiet Storm and contemporary soul eras. Collectors and soul enthusiasts have long championed their work. In niche circles across the United States, the United Kingdom, and Japan, the Soul Children's albums are considered essential documents of the Stax sound's final evolution. Reissue labels continue to bring their catalog to new listeners, allowing a younger generation to discover music that feels both vintage and surprisingly modern. What stands out most in their legacy is how seamlessly they blended heartache with harmony, crafting songs that were rich in emotional complexity. Their music holds a mirror up to the human experience, messy, painful, beautiful, and endlessly worth revisiting. The Soul Children may not have been the most celebrated act of their era, but they were one of the most truthful. And in the world of soul music, truth has a way of surviving long after the spotlight fades. As time moved forward, the Soul Children gradually shifted from charting artists to historical figures, names spoken with a quiet reverence by those who truly understood the emotional architecture of Southern soul. Their music did not vanish. It lingered, like the afterglow of a memory, rediscovered by listeners who wanted something real, something honest, something rooted in the lived experiences of adulthood. And slowly, a broader reflection began to form in both American and global music communities. In the United States, their legacy is often framed through the lens of the Stax era. They are remembered as one of the final groups to carry the label's spirit during its most turbulent period, a vocal ensemble that gave Stax a heartbeat when it desperately needed one. For fans who grew up in the late 60 and early 70 decade, their songs serve as emotional bookmarks. They recall hearing "I'll Be the Other Woman" drifting from car radios on humid southern nights, or watching couples slow dance to "The Sweeter He Is" at neighborhood gatherings where the world outside seemed far away. Younger American listeners, discovering them through streaming platforms, often respond with surprise. The harmonies feel fresh, the themes feel modern. The vulnerability cuts straight through the noise of contemporary production. For a generation raised on songs that often avoid emotional complexity, the Soul Children's catalog becomes a revelation, a reminder that soul music was once built on truth before trend. Internationally, the appreciation is even more distinct. In the United Kingdom, where Northern Soul and Southern Soul collectors have long preserved American records overlooked at home, the Soul Children are celebrated as hidden treasures of the Stax legacy. In Japan, a country known for its deep respect for vintage R&B, reissues of their albums have found devoted audiences who value their craftsmanship and emotional depth. These global listeners help sustain the group's place in musical history by passing the records, stories, and memories forward. What gives their reflection so much weight is the emotional clarity of their music. They did not shy away from themes that other groups avoided: infidelity, longing, resentment, insecurity, desire, and the complex roles people play within relationships. Their songs felt honest because they were delivered by voices willing to inhabit those emotions fully. In many ways, the Soul Children represent a version of soul music that no longer exists in mainstream form. Intimate, unpolished, profoundly human. And that is exactly why they continue to resonate today. Their legacy endures not because they chased trends, but because they told the truth. Though their time in the spotlight was brief, their impact remains deeply felt among those who know where to listen. The Soul Children may have stepped out of the public eye, but their music continues to echo across generations, across borders, and across the emotional landscape of anyone who has ever loved, lost, or longed for something they couldn't have. As the decades moved forward, the story of the Soul Children gradually shifted from a tale of chart performances to a deeper reflection on what their music represented, and why it continues to resonate with listeners who discover it long after the group's most active years came to an end. Their legacy has taken on a second life, one shaped not by the urgency of the marketplace but by the quiet admiration of fans, collectors, and historians who recognize the emotional intelligence embedded in every record they left behind. In the United States, the Soul Children exist within a very specific emotional memory. They are often remembered as one of the last great acts to emerge from the golden age of Stax, a label that defined the spirit of Southern soul. Their harmonies, their themes, and their vocal interplay captured a kind of adult storytelling that television, film, and mainstream pop music rarely touched at the time. When listeners revisit their music today, they often describe an immediate sense of familiarity, as though the songs were speaking directly to the complicated experiences that shape adult life: longing, regret, desire, temptation, forgiveness. Their catalog is a diary of emotional truth, written in 4 voices at once. For American fans who lived through the late 60 and early 70 decade, the Soul Children's music is tied to vivid memories: slow dances in dimly lit social halls, family gatherings where a record player sat in the corner spinning Stax singles, or long car rides through humid southern nights with the radio tuned to stations that played music rooted in community rather than commercial demand. Many of those listeners still speak of songs like "The Sweeter He Is" and "I'll Be the Other Woman," not just as records, but as moments, pieces of their own personal histories. Among younger American audiences, the reaction is equally striking. Many approach the group's catalog with fresh ears, discovering harmonies and themes that feel surprisingly modern. The vulnerability in their lyrics, the conversational tone in their arrangements, and the emotional honesty in their performances feel aligned with the revival of interest in deep soul, quiet storm, and slow-burning R&B. For a generation raised on digital perfection, the Soul Children offer something distinctly human: voices that crack, ache, rise, and break in real time, all without losing their power. Globally, the reflection takes on an even broader scope. In the United Kingdom, where appreciation for American soul runs deep, and collectors have preserved thousands of records that never received proper recognition at home. The Soul Children are celebrated as one of the most compelling vocal groups of their era. Many Northern soul DJs and record enthusiasts consider their albums essential listening, representing the emotional core of Memphis at a time when the city's sound was evolving into its final, most introspective phase. In Japan, where reissues and archival releases are often treated with museum-level respect, the Soul Children have gained a loyal following among listeners who value the craftsmanship and vulnerability found in classic R&B. Their music appears in curated playlists, boutique record shops, and specialized radio programs that recognize the emotional weight behind the group's harmonies. What gives their reflection such lasting power is the complexity of the stories they told. The Soul Children did not make escapist music. They made mirror music songs that reflected the real world with all its imperfections. Their decision to lean into themes of infidelity, inner conflict, and emotional compromise gave them a distinctive voice that set them apart from other groups of their time. And as society has shifted, as ideas about love and relationships have become more nuanced, younger listeners have found themselves relating to those themes with surprising intensity. Ultimately, the Soul Children's legacy endures because they captured something timeless, the way human beings wrestle with the truth when the heart refuses to keep quiet. Their music lives in the emotional corners of memory, where the most meaningful songs always settle. When we step back and look at the full arc of the Soul Children, the story feels like one of those Memphis evenings where the sun lingers a little too long in the sky before slipping away. Warm, honest, full of color and gone too soon. Their journey began during a moment of uncertainty when Stax was searching for a new voice to carry its legacy forward. And somehow, almost quietly, this four-person ensemble became that voice. They didn't arrive with fanfare. They arrived with truth. From the first harmonies of Give Them Love to the emotional weight of The Sweeter He Is, from the cinematic power of Hearsay to the gut-deep vulnerability of I'll Be the Other Woman, they crafted a world where adult emotions could be sung without disguise. Their music wasn't built for trends. It was built for people who knew that love can be complicated, relationships can be messy, and the heart rarely follows rules. That honesty is what makes their story resonate long after the spotlight moved on. Their decline wasn't dramatic. It was a slow fading, shaped by industry shifts, label collapse, and the kind of fatigue that comes from giving everything you have to a world that doesn't always give back. Yet even as their presence on the charts dimmed, their influence seeped into the fabric of soul music. You can hear echoes of the Soul Children in the storytelling of modern R&B, in the emotional frankness of quiet storm ballads, and in the rediscovery of Southern soul by collectors and younger listeners who crave something real. Today, their legacy lives in the records they left behind, the artists they inspired, and the listeners who still find themselves returning to those harmonies whenever life gets heavy. Music like theirs doesn't ask for attention. It earns it quietly, honestly, over time. So now I ask you, what is the first song that comes to mind when you think about the Soul Children, and do you believe they deserve a more honored place in soul music history? If this story helped you remember a moment, or introduced you to voices you didn't know you needed, stay with us. Leave a comment below. Share your memories, your favorite songs, your thoughts on their legacy. And if you believe these artists deserved more than they received, make sure to like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you never miss another journey into the unsung legends of our musical past. Because the Soul Children may have stepped out of the spotlight, but the truth in their voices still shines.